Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show.
I didn't even notice.
Joining us now is TMBS. I was gonna say emeritus, but I think she's always TMBS crew, and she is now. My understanding is, Bri, you're doing something. You're involved with a foundation that is involved with Jewish senior citizens.
Michael Jamal Brooks, you are going to be determined to get me into trouble in this episode. I can already tell. But
No,
I am
I'm
here
totally
in my
done.
official capacity as the National Press Secretary for the Bernie Sanders campaign, and I can have none of your tomfoolery.
All right, we are so. I'm going to give you a shofar. Okay. Briahna Joy Gray, our friend, TMBS crew, is the brilliant, ever resourceful National Press Secretary for Bernie Sanders, the campaign, the movement, and the man that we absolutely must elect president. Shofar, Bri. And look, if there wasn't a little tomfoolery, it just wouldn't be right. But now we'll pivot off of it. Don't worry. Could you imagine? I mean, look, if you went to work for another campaign, I would give you a very hard time.
I mean, as well you should. Since you've known me from the early days, I mean, people might not realize that I think the Michael Brooks Show was the first media I ever did after writing for the first time. This is before I joined The Intercept, when I was still just an anonymous lawyer in the summer of 2017. I started freelancing because I was just so frustrated with the media narratives that were out there. It was you who had me on first to talk about my article about identity politics and current affairs, and then my subsequent article about cultural appropriation.
Yes, and actually,
you put me on the map.
I quote your article in the concluding chapter of my forthcoming book, by the way.
Do you really? Which one?
The cultural appropriation one, because it relates. The distinctions you made in that piece correlate really nicely with some of the points that Cornel West made on Joe Rogan and the argument I'm making about socialist cosmopolitanism. So all the tributaries.
That Joe Rogan interview. Yeah, that interview was so great that I ended up clipping some of Cornel West for the most recent episode of our podcast, the campaign podcast, Here to Burn, which I produced. And the episode that came out this morning with Dr. Keonga Yamada Taylor is all about solidarity building and uses a lot of those clips because, I mean, you don't even have to listen to it to imagine what it means for someone like Joe Rogan to be interviewing someone like Cornel West and for them to be having such simpatico. I mean, that's the kind of work. That's the kind of gains to accessing those kinds of gains to trade is the kind of work that a successful political campaign needs to be able to do. And having him as one of our surrogates, it really helps me know that we're on the right track.
100%. I want to start by asking you, I want to get into this sort of primary juxtaposition, which is really intensifying now between what Bernie Sanders and the campaign are actually doing and the just kind of, just this relentless media barrage against them. We talked about this with Crystal Ball a little bit a couple of weeks ago, and we gave our thoughts as sympathetic outside analysts, in my case of a full endorser and so on. But before we get to that, I thought it was very revealing. You had on Jon Favreau on Here the Burn recently, and Jon Favreau, of course, is Crooked Media campaign speechwriter for Barack Obama, for President Obama. And I thought it was fascinating because at one point in the interview, and it was a very nice. I would actually recommend. I think actually particularly for people on the left who would like to hear somebody who undoubtedly speaking for myself, have plenty of disagreements with, but who is certainly he's trying to work this. He's a good faith actor is the phrase I'm looking for, and certainly in that conversation, he agreed at one point in the conversation with the central thrust of the Sanders campaign, at least as I heard it. Can you talk about that and how significant? I think that was really significant.
Yeah, I think the moment you're referring to is he gave credit Bernie Sanders a lot of credit for being the only campaign that is really treating organizing and the mass movement approach as a key part of its political strategy, and identify that as a political strategy that is required to win in this moment, which is a significant a significant moment, given that Jon Favreau represents to many on the left a much more centrist, and we talked about this at the beginning of the episode, right? Like how all of these words, descriptors for all of our respective groups can be kind of weighted and people are offended by them. But I'm hesitant to say centrist because I don't want to treat him as a bad faith operator. But someone who represents a more centrist lane, it was surprising to me how much we didn't directly go head to head on some of those big principal ideas. But where we did have some disagreement, and what kind of emerged as a theme of the episode, is this idea that the left tends to understand political conflict and people who, don't operate in the best interests of the people, let's say political bad guys, as less bad guys because they have bad personalities, or they just are kind of like sitting like cartoon witches in a castle rubbing their hands together, wishing ill on the American people, but because, we think of it in terms of systems of power. So there could be a perfectly well-meaning politician who feels that in order to get reelected in their district has to be beholden to the biggest donors in their interest, in their district rather, who might be from the pharmaceutical companies, might be from the gun industry, any number of industries that have interests that are opposed to the majority of Americans. Whereas people on the left, in the center, whatever you want to call it, moderate Democrats tend to characterize good actors and bad actors in terms of just like kind of personal will. Right. And so there was this moment when we were talking about healthcare, and the last round of debates had just happened, or at least the first night of them had happened. And we were talking about the healthcare policies. And Jon Favreau implied that there wasn't that much daylight between Kamala Harris's policy and Bernie Sanders' policy.
That was a moment where I didn't feel as charitable. I'll just say that.
I mean, look, the purpose of this episode was to bridge the divide, right? So we talked through it. I didn't intend to get on that subject for 20 minutes of a podcast, but it ended up happening.
You had to.
And what kind of came out of that, and what I think ended up being a theme. And there's a version of this episode that you could watch on YouTube, right? Straight through the interview. There's another version that the podcast, and in the podcast I editorialize a little bit at certain points. And at the end, I basically said, what the theme of this, I think, that emerged was this kind of lack of cynicism from the center about what is really motivating candidates. So at one point, Jon Favreau says about Kamala Harris's plan, well, why do you think she could have or would have supported Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All plan in 2017 or whatever it was, and then change her mind now if she were bought by interest? It doesn't make sense to me that she would say one thing and say another thing if she didn't really believe it. And to me, and I don't mean to target Kamala Harris in particular, but to me, conceptually, the idea of believing something at one point when you're not in the middle of a campaign season, and then saying something different at a different point when you are solicitous of donations, or you are being, having conversations with members of the Democratic establishment about who should be the establishment bearer, the standard bearer candidate for the party. It's entirely consistent to have a different point of view when the stakes are higher. And he seemed to see that as me kind of like, trying to knock Harris in particular, as opposed to making a structural commentary on just how politics works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was incredibly revealing, because I actually think in a way that attitude actually is a bridge into understanding, I think, also some of the incredible media hostility that Bernie Sanders gets, because there are the obvious and structural runs, which you guys are hitting, and I'd like you to talk about a little bit. And some of it is material, right? Like, you don't need to, it doesn't need to be conscious or spelled out. But I mean, of course, there's a reason. He said, yes, like, of course there's a correlation between Jake Tapper and Anderson Cooper always, and others, those are just the names that come to mind, always asking incredibly weighted questions in favor of, Republican industry talking points about healthcare. Is that, I mean, look, if the CNN lineup was primarily advertised by, the UAW and the Teamsters, the guiding lines of the questions would obviously be different. Again, you'd have to be in my opinion, you'd have to be extremely naive to not understand that. But I think that actually is the social part of the problem, which is I think that there's a material thing that is being run up against, but then there's actually also that there's a lot of folks in media who don't even necessarily see that part, the material part of it, and they actually are kind of socially offended by pointing out the obvious. So you have this weird relationship where you guys are saying something that's actually like pretty obvious to a vast majority of normal people, but the filter bubbles that it goes through are populated by like the tiny part of the population that is so immersed in it that they don't get it. And I think that's maybe why they're so triggered.
Yeah, I mean, I've never read Manufacturing Consent, but I found myself wanting to know more for no particular reason.
You're going to need to read that for this campaign, Bri.
So I was someone had put together like a little YouTube. There was a movie made and someone put together like a summary of it. So I was watching that actually earlier today. And what I was struck by was, the media has chosen to characterize Bernie's kind of like, off the cuff kind of humorous remarks about Washington Post and Jeff Bezos as this literal like, oh, there's an edict from Jeff Bezos, a memo goes out, and he's canceling op-eds and dictating the editorial room, by picking up the phone or what have you.
Right.
When the argument is so much more subtle, and it has to do with things like the fact that the people who are pundits in journalism and creating the content for these shows are members of an elite class. And I say that as someone who was a journalist and a member, some absurd percentage of journalists went to Ivy League schools.
Right.
Probably in part because to become a journalist, you have to have such an incredible amount of financial outlay at your disposal to take the kind of gigs that you have to take to work yourself up, Manufacturing Consent, they talk about the fact that if you have a media institution that's driven by ad sales, and advertisers are constantly pushing to sell higher value products, then what's happening is that you're constantly courting a wealthier market that is obviously going to have different interests and needs than the average everyday worker. And then the mess that you're going to attract them with messaging and stories that is attractive to that audience, which means that the interest, needs, the stories that appeal to and concern everyday working people do not get the same airtime. So when Bernie Sanders says, we don't talk about poverty, no one asks me about poverty, it's not because we're making some accusations. This gets back to the Jon Favreau point. It's not because we're making some accusation that, Anderson Cooper personally doesn't care about poverty. I'm not making a claim about his morals or ethics as an individual. I'm sure he cares a great deal. But it does say something that, we live in a society that puts us in positions where, we have a person who's famous for being the son of a famous billionaire as one of our, Gloria Vanderbilt's child, as one of our, as a figurehead on a major news network. And that's, I don't want to single him out as a one example. And again, it's not about him personally, but it's about what kind of structures exist where a certain kind of person is talking about the news, certain kinds of interests are represented, and how do you get to a place where there's such an extraordinary disconnect between what's happening in the media and what's happening on the ground that, surprise, surprise, things like Donald Trump happen. And why have we not learned from the lesson of 2016?
And it's a very interesting, I've had my criticisms of Joe Rogan, sometimes pretty sharp. There's other things I really like about Joe Rogan. And then there's just, there's other, just the other part that content, some of the stuff, it's just people are interested in different things and not interested in others. And people need to, I think, sort of, ease up a bit on some of the aspects of sort of worrying about every single aspect of content all the time. But what I did find striking is that, Joe Rogan was so much more able in a weird, I don't think he would characterize himself this way. I don't know how he would, but I actually think in a way he's actually much more representative of what somebody who might self-identify as being in some type of political center would actually look like in 2019, which is like heterodox, very all over the place, and again, the truth of the matter was that he gave Bernie Sanders an incredibly fair hearing. He pushed him in some ways that I know people on my side didn't like, but frankly, like, I've heard those questions. Not every person who's ever asked me like the socialism questions or whatever are arch reactionaries who don't get it.
Right.
There are plenty of normal people who are super stoked and receptive about creating a humane, good society. And they have some concerns, some of which maybe are based off of some misinformation, or others of which are based off of like, there's like human history. And some systems that have called themselves those names have been pretty bad to people. And, but I think that was so revealing that it's like the sort of at least some form of independent, quote unquote, centrism at least has the space to not be so innately offended by all of these taboos that seem obvious for the rest of us.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I will admit to being somewhat naive about this until kind of an embarrassingly adult age. But I know there was this moment where I was, again, freelancing, still just being a lawyer, and I was reached out to by someone on who writes for The Atlantic. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, we might be doing something where you might be able to write for us and come on board. And I was very excited about it because, again, I was trying to escape my law firm.
I remember.
Then he caveated it. You remember that. You were a sounding board for me. Yeah, like I remember there was this moment where he said he admitted, okay, but FYI, because at the time I had been just writing for Current Affairs. And he said, FYI, you probably won't be able to be as progressive here or say as much here. Don't remember his phraseology, but basically you won't be able to go so far left here as you can, as you've been doing so far. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, this is The Atlantic. Mm-hmm. I never would have thought for a second that I wouldn't have been able to say anything under the sun here. And I think that's part of the issue is that we tend to see media outlets by their branding and kind of take them at face value. And so, okay, The Atlantic is progressive, and I ignore whether its leadership has had a record as a writer in which he defended a lot of, interventionist atrocities that many people on the left contemporaneously disagreed with, right? And that's
very
kind of
much
whitewashed.
so.
Right. Yeah. Right. Like we on our media bias episode that we did a couple of weeks ago, episode 17, we look at some Media Matter statistics about which news outlet has the most skewed panels, and surprise is actually MSNBC,
right, whose
Sunday morning panels are skewed left only 8% of the time, to the right like some 60% of the time, whereas Fox News are more balanced, more fair and balanced than MSNBC. So we turn on MSNBC, we see a host, we see that she's sitting there on MSNBC, and we assume, okay, it's a liberal network. We're going to take the words that are coming out of her mouth and the questions and the framings that she's providing in good faith. And I think that's how we get some of this bleeding, where there were all of these questions that were asked in the debates that really could have been written by Fox News panel. There was nothing to distinguish them from what you might expect from the Fox News town hall, which, to jog everybody's memory, Bernie Sanders did. It was the most viewed town hall to date in this election cycle, and he won over the entire Fox News town hall audience despite the prevarications of the host. So this is where we are. There's been this bleeding of who represents whose interests. Then the left, kind of pandering to the right, who have been working the rest for a really long time. And some people, this might not be in their taste, the fact that Bernie Sanders was offering a media critique. But if you think about it this way, the right's working of the rest has resulted in us having an entire media establishment which benefits the right.
That's right.
And
exactly.
maybe it's time for us to push back a little bit and make sure that maybe, just a thought, maybe there should be an actual, leftist, a progressive on one of these panels interviewing folks during a debate. What if someone like a Waleed Shahid, or a Michael Jamal Brooks, we're able to ask questions? What kind of questions then would moderate Democrats be getting about how they're going to perhaps explain why 10 million people under their plan or 30 million people under their plan are going to remain uninsured?
Right.
How are they going to account for the tens of thousands of deaths that will accrue over the 10 years that they have set out, the 10 years timeline they've set out for how long it's going to take for their healthcare plan?
Why is their student loan plan a gentrification accelerator that doesn't relieve the loan crisis? Yes.
I mean,
I'd ask it in a less weighted way, but yes. Although, frankly, they didn't. They did ask it in a weighted way. John Delaney, would you like to ask Bernie Sanders why his plan is going to, turn us into 1984? Would you like a follow-up?
Right.
It's just embarrassing.
I was at the National Association of Black Journalists conference in Miami last week, and Bernie Sanders gave remarks. It was only Bernie Sanders, Cory Booker, Pete Buttigieg, and Weld there to give remarks. And Bernie Sanders, the crowd was just on his side, and it was a really great event. We're going to be clipping bits of that soon and circulating them because more people need to get eyes on it. But what really struck me is that the host, it was Dan Newkirk, who writes for The Atlantic, was one of them, and this guy, I'm blocking his name, Craig. Anyway, it's not important. And the MSNBC host, all black panels in ABJ. And this guy asked Bernie Sanders about his student loan program. He says, hypothetically speaking, if someone were to have worked really hard and paid off their loans just 2 or 3 years ago, the audience starts laughing because he's obviously talking about himself. Why is it fair that their loans get canceled and mine don't, basically? Right. And the audience treated it as a joke, but he was treating it kind of seriously. And I was really struck by this question because I have never in my life, and one, because I hear it all the time, right? I had a big fight with one of my boyfriend's friends about this exact same issue a few weeks ago. But what struck me about it is you never hear a version of that question that says, hi, I'm a millennial who cannot own a home because of student debt.
Right.
Why is it fair that the government gave X, Y, or Z subsidy to a homeowner and not to me? Why is it fair that someone can own $1 million home and discharge the entirety of their interest or deduct it from their taxes, the entirety of their interest payments, but as someone who has student debt, I can only discharge up to $2,000 of my payment, and that's only if I earn less than $60,000 a year. Right? The kind of benefits that are given to families, homeowners, the kind of people who have historically been, backed as the middle-class backbone of this country, this dramatically shrinking middle-class backbone of this country, are never perceived of as giveaways in the same way. And it would never occur to him to see himself as a beneficiary of myriad programs, childcare programs, et cetera, that someone like myself isn't a beneficiary of. But it would never occur to me in a million years to begrudge somebody else that public schools are free or libraries are free just because I am, sadly still ordering my books online.
Get on Amazon and get manufacturing consent, Brie.
That's literally what's going to happen.
I know. I'm encouraging you. I'm skipping my time with all the idealism. Just get the book. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.